Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another session of my little stories. I know the world has been rife and full of troubles of late, and what with quarantines and righteous protest and all the rest. But here we are to tell a little story and hopefully distract from the stresses of the world for a very short time before we all get back to it. Now, my story today concerns some brothers, three of them to be exact. And they lived a long time ago with an old man and his wife, for they were his sons. The eldest son was called Martin, the second Michael, and the third Jack. Pardon me. Now, one evening they were all seated around the table eating their supper, when the old man suddenly said, "Martin, I feel that I cannot live much longer. You are the eldest. You will inherit this shabby hut, but if you value my blessing, be good to your mothers and brothers." "Certainly, father," replied Martin. "How do you suppose I could do them wrong?" he said, as he helped himself to all the best cuts of meat on the dish. The old man saw nothing. Michael looked on in surprise. Jack was so astonished he forgot to eat his dinner. But a few weeks later the father fell ill, and sent for his sons, who were out hunting, to bid them farewell. Like you do. After giving good advice to the two eldest, he turned to Jack. "My youngest boy," he said, "you haven't got the sense as other people have, but if heaven has deprived you of some of your wit, it has given you a kind heart. Always listen to what it says, and take heed to the words of your mother and your brothers as well as you're able." So saying, the old man laid back on his pillows and died, because it's dramatic. The cries of grief uttered by Martin and Michael sounded throughout the house, but Jack remained beside the bed of his father, still and silent, as though he were dead also. At length he got up and went out into the garden and hid himself in the trees, and wept like a child, while his two brothers made ready for the funeral. No sooner was the old man in the ground than Michael and Martin agreed that they would go out into the world and seek their fortunes, while Jack should stay at home with his mother. Jack would have liked nothing better than to sit and dream by the fire, but the mother, who was very old herself, declared there's nothing for him to do, and that he must also go out in the world with his brothers. So one fine morning, the three of them set out. Martin and Michael carried 2 great bags full of food, but Jack didn't carry anything. This made his brothers very angry, for the day was hot, the bags were heavy. About noon they sat down under a tree and began to eat. Jack was as hungry as they were, but he knew it was useless to ask for anything, so he threw himself down under another tree and wept. "Another time perhaps you won't be so lazy and will bring food for yourself," said Martin. But to his surprise, Jack turned on him and answered, "You're a nice pair. You talk of seeking your fortune so as not to be a burden on our mother, and you carry off all the food she has in the house." This reply was so unexpected that for some moments neither of the brothers made any answer. And then they offered Jack some of their food, and when he'd finished eating, they went on their way. Towards evening they reached a small hut, and knocking at the door asked if they might spend the night there. The man, who was a woodcutter, invited them in and begged them to sit down to supper. Martin thanked him, but being very proud, explained it was only shelter they wanted, and they had plenty of food. He and Michael at once opened their bags and began to eat, while Jack hid in a corner. The wife, upon seeing this, took pity on him and called him to come and share their supper, which he did, and very good he found it. At this, Martin regretted deeply that he had been so foolish as to refuse, for his bits of bread and cheese seemed very hard when he smelt the savory soup his brother was enjoying. "Well, you shan't have that chance again," he thought. The next morning he insisted on plunging into a thick forest where they were not likely to meet anybody. For a long time they wandered hither and thither, for they had no path to guide them, and no idea where they were going, other than to find fortune, which of course would spring upon them, or so they thought. But at last they came to a wide clearing, in the midst of which stood a castle. Jack shouted with delight, but Martin, who was in a bad temper, said sharply, "We must have taken a wrong turn. Let's go back." "Idiot," replied Michael, who was hungry as well, and like many people when they are hungry, was very cross. "We set out to travel through the world, and what does it matter if we go right or the left?" Without another word he took the path to the castle, closely followed by Jack. and after a moment Martin did as well. The door of the castle stood wide open. They entered a great hall, looking about them. Nothing was to be seen, and suddenly Martin, and he did not know why, suddenly felt frightened. He would have left the castle at once, but stopped when Jack boldly walked up to a door in the wall and opened it. For he could not for he could not for the very shame to be outdone by his youngest brother, and passed him on to another splendid hall, which was filled floor to ceiling with great pieces of copper. The sight quite dazzled Martin and Michael, who emptied all the provisions that remained in all of their bags and heaped them up instead with copper. Scarcely had they done this when Jack threw open another door, and this time it was led to a hall filled with silver. In an instant the brothers had turned their bags upside down, so the copper had tumbled down on the floor, and were shoveling in handfuls of silver. They had hardly finished when Jack opened a third door, and this room was filled with gold. So bright that their eyes grew sore as they looked at it. However, they soon recovered, and quickly emptied all the silver, and filled it all with gold. When they could hold no more, Martin said, "We'd better be off now, lest somebody come home, and we might not know what to do." Followed by Michael, he hastily left the castle. Jack lingered behind for a few minutes, and put a piece of gold, copper, and silver into his pocket, and ate the food that his brothers had thrown on the floor in the first room. And then finally he went after them, and found them lying down to rest in the midst of a forest near sunset. Martin had begun to feel hungry, so when Jack arrived he bade him return to the castle and bring with him the bread and cheese that they'd left there. Because, of course, entitlement. "Well," Jack says, "it's hardly worth doing. I picked up all that food and ate it." This reply, the brothers were quite angry and fell on him, beating him and calling him names because it was obviously his fault, and they were quite tired and angry. Martin then cried, go where you like, but never come near us again." And poor Jack ran crying into the woods. The next morning his brothers went home because apparently there was a shortcut or something, and bought a beautiful house where they lived with their mother like a great lord. Jack remained there for some hours in hiding, thankful to be safe from his tormentors. But when no one came to trouble him, and his back didn't ache quite so much, he began to think what he'd better do. At length he made up his mind to go to the castle and take as much money as he could carry, because obviously that's what his brothers had done, and that would enable him to live in comfort for the rest of his life. This decided, he sprang up and set back along the path that led to the castle. As before, the door stood open, and he went on till he reached the Hall of Gold. There he took off his jacket and tied the sleeves together so he might make a kind of bag, and then began to pour in the gold by the handfuls, when all at once a voice like thunder shook the entire castle. This was followed by a voice as hoarse as that of a bull, which also cried out, "I smell the smell of a man." Two giants entered. "So, little worm, it is you who steals our treasures. Well, we've got you now, and we'll cook you for our supper." But here the other giant drew him aside for a moment, and they whispered together. At length the first giant spoke. "To please my friend, I will spare your life on one condition, and that is, for the future you shall guard our treasures. If you are hungry, take this little table and rap on it, saying as you do so, 'The dinner of an emperor,' and you'll get as much food as you want." So it was with a light heart that Jack promised what was asked of him, and for some days enjoyed himself mightily. He had everything he could want, and did nothing from morning till night. But by and by he began to get very bored. "Let these giants guard their treasures themselves. I am going away, but I will leave all the gold and silver behind me, and I will take naught but you, my good little table." So tucking the table under his arm, he started off for the forest. But he did not linger there long, and soon found himself in the field on the other side. And there he saw an old man, who begged Jack to give him something to eat, because random people in the wilderness obviously don't know what they're doing there. "Well, you could not have asked a better person," said Jack, and signing for him to sit down at the table under a tree, he set the table in front of them and struck it 3 times, crying, "The dinner of an emperor!" And he hardly uttered those words when fish and meat of all kinds appeared upon it. "It's a clever trick of yours," said the old man, when he had eaten as much as he wanted. Give it to me in exchange for a treasure which I have that is yet better. Do you see this coronet? Well, you have to tell it that you wish for an army, and you will have as many soldiers as you require." Now, since he'd been left to himself, Jack had gotten ambitious, so after a moment's hesitation, he took the coronet and gave the table in exchange. The old man bade him farewell and set off down the path, one path, while Jack chose another. For a long time he was quite pleased with his new possession. Then something strange happened. He felt hungry, and he wished for his table back. But there was no houses in sight, and he wanted some supper badly. All at once he remembered his coronet, and a wicked thought entered his mind. "200 hussars, forward!" cried he, and in the neighing of the horses and the clanking of the swords were close at hand. The officer who rode at their head approached him and politely inquired what he wished for him to do. "A mile along that road you will find an old man carrying a table. Take that table and bring it back." The officer saluted and went back to his men, who started as a gallop to do Jack's bidding. In 10 minutes they had returned, bearing the table with them. "That is all, thank you," and the soldiers disappeared back into the coronet. Oh, what a good supper! Quite forgetting that he owed it to a mean trick. The next day he breakfasted early and then walked on towards the nearest town. On the way thither he met another old man who begged for something to eat. "Certainly you shall have something to eat," required Jack, and placed the table on the ground. "The dinner of an emperor!" When all sorts of food and dishes appeared, at first the old man ate quite greedily and said nothing, but after his hunger was satisfied he turned to Jack and said, "This is a very clever trick, but give to me the table and you shall have something better." "I don't really believe there is anything better," said Jack. "Oh, yes, there is. Here's my bag. In this bag are as many castles as you could possibly want." Jack thought for a moment, and then replied, "Oh, very well, I will exchange with you," and passed the table to the old man, and hung the bag over his arm. And then 5 minutes later he summoned 500 lancers of the coronet, and bade them go after the old man and fetch back the table. Now, by his cunning he had obtained the possession of 3 magical objects, he resolved to return to his native place. Blah! Fly in my tongue. Smearing his face with dirt, and tearing his clothes to look like a beggar, he stopped passers-by, and on pretense of seeking money or food, questioned them about the village gossip. In this manner he learned that his brothers had become great men, much respected in all the country around, and when he heard that, he lost no time going to the door of their fine house, and imploring them to give him food and shelter. The only thing he got was hard words, and a command to be elsewhere. At length, through his mother's entreaty, he was told he might pass the night in the stable, and here he waited until everyone was in the house and asleep. Then he drew his bag from under his cloak, and produced a castle in that place, and the coronet gave him soldiers to guard that castle, and while the table furnished him with good supper. In the morning he caused it all to vanish, and when his brothers entered the stable they found him lying in the straw. He remained here for many days, doing nothing, and as far as anyone knew, eating nothing. His conduct puzzled his brothers greatly, and they put such constant questions to him that at length he told them the secret of the table, and even gave them dinner, which far outdid anything they'd ever seen or heard of. But though they'd solemnly promised to reveal nothing, somehow or other the tale leaked out, and before long it reached the ears of the king. That evening his chamberlain arrived at Jack's house with a request from the king that he might borrow the table for 3 days. "Very well," answered Jack. "You may take this back with you. Tell his majesty that if he does not return my table at the end of 3 days, I will make war upon him." And so the chamberlain carried away the table and took it straight to the king, telling him at the same time of Jack's threat, at which they both laughed till their sides ached. Now the king was delighted with that table and the dinners it gave him, and when 3 days were over he could not make up his mind to part with it. Instead he sent for his carpenter and bade him copy it exactly, and when it was done he told his chamberlain to return to Jack with his best thanks. It happened to be dinner time, and Jack invited the chamberlain, who knew nothing of that trick, to stay and dine. The good man, who had eaten several excellent meals provided by the table in the last 3 days, accepted that invitation with pleasure, even though he was to dine in a stable, and sat down on the straw beside Jack. "The dinner of an emperor!" cried Jack. But nothing happened. Not even a morsel of cheese appeared. "The dinner of an emperor!" shouted Jack in a voice of thunder. Then the truth dawned upon him, and he crushed that table between his hands. He turned to the chamberlain, who, bewildered and half frightened, was wondering how to get away. "Tell your false king that tomorrow I will destroy his castle as easily as I have destroyed this table." The chamberlain hastened back to the palace and gave Jack's message, at which he laughed more than before, and called all his courtiers to hear the story. But they were not so merry when they woke the next morning and beheld 10,000 horsemen, as many archers, surrounding the palace. The king saw it was useless to attempt to hold out the siege, and he took the white flag of truce in one hand and the real table in the other, and he set out to look for Jack. "I've committed you a crime," said he, "but I will do my best to make up for it. Here is your table, which I own with the shame that I tried to steal, and you shall have besides my daughter as your wife." There was no need to delay the marriage, when the table was able to furnish the most splendid banquet they ever had seen. And after everyone had eaten and drunk as much as they wanted, Jack took his bag and commanded a castle filled with all sorts of treasures to arise from the park for himself and his bride. At this proof of his power, the king's heart died within him. "Your magic is greater than mine," he said, "and you are young and strong, while I am old and tired. Therefore I give you the scepter from my hand and the crown from my head to rule my people better than I have." So at last Jack's ambition was satisfied. He could not hope to be more than king, and as long as he had his coronet to provide him with soldiers, he was secure against his enemies. He never did forgive his brothers for the way they had treated him, and though he presented his mother with a beautiful castle and everything she could possibly wish for, in the center of his own palace was a treasure chamber, and in this chamber the table, the coronet, and the bag were kept as the most prized of all possessions. Not a week passed without a visit from King John to make sure they were safe. King Jack, sorry. He reigned long and well, and died a very old man, beloved of his people. But his good example was not followed by his sons or his grandsons, who grew so proud that they were ashamed to think that the founder of their line had once been a poor young man. And as they and all the world could not fail to remember it so long as the table, the coronet, and the bag were shown in that treasure chamber, one king, more foolish than the rest, locked them away in a dark, damp cellar. For some time after that the kingdom yet remained, though it became weaker and weaker with every year that passed. Then one day a rumor reached the king that a large army was marching against him. Vaguely he recollected some tales he had heard about a magic coronet which could provide as many soldiers as would serve to conquer the earth, which had been removed by his grandfather to a cellar. Thither he hastened, that he might renew his power once more, and in that black and slimy pit he found the treasures indeed, but the table fell to pieces when he touched it. In the coronet there already remained a few fragments of leather belts, which rats had gnawed upon, and in the bag there was nothing but broken bits of stone. And the king bowed his head to the doom that awaited him, and in his heart he cursed the ruin wrought by the pride and foolishness of himself and his forefathers. And now we come to the moral of this tale, because even though it doesn't have one listed, I'd like to think there is one. Everything we have and we got by trickery and mean tricks, even the good things. And though we did good things with them for a long, long time, we seem to have put those good things away. And now they've all turned to rot and ruin because of things our forefathers and ancestors did that we have not yet undone. Something to think about, isn't it?